At June 22, 1941. Minsk Military District Headquarters, at 2:17 a.m. in the morning. A dim corridor flickered under failing bulbs as General Dmitry Pavlov walked briskly toward the communications room. The air was thick with cigarette smoke, sweat, and the faint tremor of distant explosions, explosions that, only minutes ago, no one believed were possible. Outside, the night sky over Belarus glowed with unnatural light. Red arcs. White flashes. The low, rolling thunder of artillery that seemed to come from everywhere at once. For a moment, Pavlov paused near a window. He pressed a hand to the glass. It vibrated with each impact. Across 1,000 kilometers of frontier, the German Wehrmacht, 3 million strong, had unleashed Operation Barbarossa, the largest invasion in human history. And Pavlov's Western Front, sprawling from the Baltic to the Pripyat marshes, lay directly in the path of Army Group Center, the most powerful of the three German spearheads. A telegraph operator rushed to him, face pale, hands shaking. "Comrade General, messages from Grodno, from Brest, from Bialystok. They say the border is under full attack. Bombers. Artillery. Panzer formations." Pavlov stared at him, silent. Only hours earlier, he had read the maps he believed showed German divisions still in reserve, German armor still redeploying, German air units still shifting their bases. According to his assessments, the Wehrmacht was not ready. According to him, the frontier was unstable but not in danger. According to Pavlov, the Germans would not attack tonight. Now Brest fortress burned. Railway lines shattered. Soviet airfields erupted into orange fireballs as rows of parked aircraft, wings touching wing, fuselages exposed, detonated one after another. And for a moment, Pavlov felt the cold realization that this was not a series of border provocations. Not an escalation. Not a test of Soviet resolve. The floor shook again. A fresh wave of explosions rolled through the night. A colonel burst into the communications room and barked. "General Pavlov. Minsk reports that aircraft have been destroyed on the ground. The phone lines to Brest are gone. The frontier posts have gone silent." Pavlov steadied himself, hand gripping the edge of a table covered in maps. Beside them lay the files he had signed only hours earlier, reports dismissing German movements as reconnaissance, maps interpreted as defensive deployments, not offensive preparations. The room fell into a brief, eerie silence. Then the first Luftwaffe bomb struck just outside the headquarters. Dust rained from the ceiling. A clock crashed to the floor, stopping at 2:19 a.m. Pavlov lifted his eyes to the map of the Western Front pinned to the wall. Red pins showed Soviet divisions stretched thin along the frontier. Black pins, German units, were placed far from the border, exactly where Soviet intelligence insisted they still remained. Those black pins were lies, a lies born of hope, of fear, of political pressure, of misread intentions, and of a general who desperately wanted the world to hold still for one more night. The greatest catastrophe ever to strike the Soviet Union had erupted. And General Dmitry Pavlov, commander of the Western Front, stood at its very center. To understand the tragedy that unfolded on June 22, 1941, you must step back into the months and years that preceded it. Back to a continent teetering on the edge of a storm. Back to a Soviet Union struggling to read a world moving far faster than its generals could react. In 1939, the German-Soviet non-aggression pact had divided Eastern Europe and bought both nations time. But beneath the diplomatic smiles, Adolf Hitler's intentions were already set. His war in the East, Lebensraum, the conquest of living space, was not a strategy born of opportunity. It was a conviction shaped over decades. And yet, even as German armor rolled through France in 1940 with blinding speed, the Soviet leadership believed there was still time. Time to reorganize the Red Army. Time to modernize aging equipment. Time to recover from Joseph Stalin's purges, which had torn out the heart of Soviet military leadership just 2 years earlier. The Red Army of 1941 was massive, millions of men, thousands of tanks, thousands of aircraft. But size masked fragility. Communications were slow. Logistics were fractured. Command structures were rigid. And above all, initiative was feared. Once a talented tank commander in the Spanish Civil War, Pavlov had shown both daring and innovation. But the purges swept away most of the old guard, and Pavlov, loyal and reliable, found himself elevated to roles previously occupied by far more experienced commanders. By 1940, Stalin placed him at the head of the Western Special Military District, the vast frontier stretching from Lithuania to the Pripyat marshes, a region destined to absorb the full force of Germany's future assault. But Pavlov did not receive a front in peace. He received a front drowning in contradictions. German divisions moved steadily toward the border throughout the spring of 1941. Luftwaffe bases expanded. Railway lines thickened. Panzer groups assembled in forests so close that, on clear days, Soviet border guards claimed they could hear engines testing. Reports poured into Moscow. Some from scouts. Some from aerial reconnaissance. Some from underground networks that risked their lives to gather tiny fragments of truth. But each report collided with the same wall. Stalin's unshakable conviction that Germany would not attack the Soviet Union in 1941. So Soviet intelligence bent under the weight of fear. Numbers were altered. Divisions were relocated on paper. Warnings were softened. The German buildup was interpreted not as a prelude to invasion, but as pressure. A negotiation tactic. A tool for squeezing concessions from the USSR. And in this fog of political denial, Pavlov tried to read the maps placed before him. Maps showing German infantry far in the rear. Maps showing panzer divisions not yet concentrated. Maps produced by departments terrified to draw anything that suggested war. Maps that reassured Moscow, and reassured Pavlov, that Germany would not strike. On June 21, the night before the invasion, Pavlov reported to the Soviet High Command that the Western Front was tense but stable. He insisted that German units remained in march positions, not attack formations. He repeated that German armored divisions had not fully approached the frontier. As he gave this assessment, 344 German infantry battalions and 3,400 tanks were already positioned along his border. Luftwaffe bomber squadrons sat warmed and fueled on airfields pointed directly at his cities. And German engineers had cut the last gaps in the barbed wire across the Bialystok-Minsk corridor. But Pavlov had one more obstacle, the terrain of his own mind. He trusted what he had seen in Spain. He believed war required visible preparation, the kind of open build-up detectable by even the simplest reconnaissance unit. He believed Hitler would not risk a war on two fronts while Britain still resisted. He believed the Red Army would have days or weeks of warning. He believed the maps. And those beliefs carried immeasurable weight, for Pavlov commanded the single most endangered section of the entire Soviet frontier. His forces, arranged in a deep, awkward bulge around Bialystok, formed what historians would later call the Bialystok Salient. A vulnerable protrusion, enveloped on three sides by German armies waiting to strike. A trap wide open. A trap only solvable through early warning and swift retreat. But retreat was politically forbidden. And warning never came. So the Red Army remained in the salient. Thousands of tanks. Hundreds of thousands of troops. A quarter of the entire Western Front. All because the maps said the Germans were not yet ready. All because those maps were misread, softened, edited, or simply wrong. Pavlov would not know the scale of that mistake until it was too late. Until German panzers erupted across the frontier with a speed no one imagined possible. Until his airfields were wiped out within minutes. Until the Bialystok salient collapsed, sealing the fate of 4 Soviet armies. And it all began with a single, fatal premise. The enemy is not ready. The enemy is not here. The enemy will not attack. But the enemy was ready. The enemy was there. And the attack had already begun. In the final weeks before the invasion, the tension along the western frontier grew heavy enough to feel in the air itself. But to the Soviet High Command, tension was not proof. Suspicion was not certainty. And certainty, not accuracy, was the currency demanded in Stalin's Moscow. Throughout May and early June 1941, a strange duel unfolded along the border. Not of guns or tanks, but of interpretations. The Germans moved. The Soviets watched. And Pavlov tried to make sense of movements that refused to fit any pattern he understood. Every day he received reports. Columns of German trucks. Rail cars loaded with tanks. Roads cut through forests where there had been none a month earlier. Engine noise at night. Soldiers rehearsing crossings along the Bug River. To many, these signs pointed in one direction. To Pavlov, they still had an alternative explanation. But the conflict building around him was more than military. It was psychological. It was political. It was the impossible task of commanding an army while trying to avoid contradicting a dictator. Inside his headquarters, officers began to split into quiet camps. Some whispered that war was hours away. Others insisted that the Germans were bluffing. All of them watched Pavlov carefully, waiting for a signal, a command, a single line of certainty. But Pavlov had few certainties left. On June 14, a full week before the attack, the Soviet intelligence service delivered a report of exceptional clarity. German forces were completing their deployment. The invasion was imminent, possibly within 10 days. Pavlov read the document, then placed it on his desk without comment. He wrote a short note. Unverified. Await additional confirmation. The same day, German reconnaissance aircraft flew deep into his territory. They photographed airfields, supply lines, anti-aircraft positions. They mapped the very routes their tanks would use. Yet Soviet fighters received strict orders not to engage, to fire upon a German aircraft without central approval. Even in Soviet airspace. Could be interpreted as provocation. So the planes came and went unchallenged. And Pavlov read the German movements through the lens of diplomatic caution, not military logic. On the night of June 20th, 2 days before the invasion, a German sergeant deserted across the Bug River, hands raised, begging to report to Soviet officers. He claimed the invasion would begin in 48 hours. He described the very sectors that would receive the heaviest blows. Pavlov received the report. He did not ignore it. He simply could not accept it, not without approval from above. He forwarded the intelligence to Moscow. The People's Commissar of Defense, Timoshenko, and Chief of Staff Zhukov examined it and produced the answer Pavlov likely expected. Provocation. Disinformation. The Germans are attempting to lure us into action. Maintain readiness. Do not respond. It was the same message that had guided Soviet behavior for months. Do nothing that might anger Hitler. And so Pavlov obeyed. The build-up continued. Inside the German lines, the storm tightened. Panzer Group 2 under General Heinz Guderian, one of the most formidable armored forces ever assembled, completed its deployment across from Pavlov's sector. Infantry divisions spread out in long, silent rows. Artillery batteries dug into the soft earth. Bridges were reinforced in secrecy. Field commanders rehearsed timings down to the minute. At dusk on June 21st, German soldiers received their sealed orders. Inside each envelope was a single phrase. The German commanders knew exactly where they would strike. They understood the geography, the weaknesses of Soviet defenses, the narrow channels where armored thrusts could break through like lightning. And yet, late that same evening, Pavlov still believed war was avoidable, not because he dismissed the danger, but because every warning had been contradicted by higher authority. Every map he had been given suggested the German concentration was incomplete. Every conversation with Moscow ended with the same command. At 23:10 on June 21st, Pavlov sent his final message to his armies before the attack. It was the last peaceful order he would ever give. Then came the final and most bitter twist of all. Hours before the invasion, the Soviet border armies began moving their own units, but not forward. Not into defensive positions. They were being rotated, reorganized, and redistributed according to new plans that assumed there was no immediate danger. Columns of Soviet trucks rolled along exposed highways just as German bombers lifted from their airfields. Regiments marched in the open just as German artillery crews loaded their first shells. Airfields were crowded with aircraft parked wing to wing just as the Luftwaffe engines reached full power. The trap was not created by the Germans alone. The Soviets had walked into it. Guided by false assumptions, incomplete intelligence, and a general's belief that the maps in his hands were accurate. Pavlov stepped out of his headquarters at around 1:50 a.m. and looked toward the dark horizon. A faint glow flickered in the distance, German signal flares arcing into the sky. He looked back toward his map room, toward the symbols and markings he had trusted for so many months. Symbols that were already obsolete. Markings that no longer described reality. Maps that had betrayed him. Or were never truthful to begin with. At that exact moment, across the frontier, the first German guns flashed in the dark. A single, violent ripple of orange fire that raced from the Baltic to the Romanian border. The invasion of the Soviet Union had begun. And Pavlov's entire front, arranged around a fatal misreading, now stood in the path of destruction. June 22, 1941. 3:15 a.m. The night over Belarus tore open. A thunderous, rolling boom shook Pavlov's headquarters. Then another. Then dozens more. The first wave of German artillery struck the frontier like a wall of fire. Explosions rippled across the dark hills, revealing silhouettes of Soviet bunkers disintegrating under the impact. Pavlov staggered as windows shattered across the corridor. A messenger burst through the door, shouting over the roar. The words felt unreal, even as the evidence crashed down upon him. The invasion he had spent months denying was now ripping through the frontier with merciless speed. At 3:40 a.m., the sky filled with sound. A deep, mechanical growl growing louder, heavier, until the very air trembled with it. The first wave of Luftwaffe bombers swept over WWII, Bialystok, Grodno, Brest, Lida, and Minsk. Hundreds of aircraft. Perfect formation. Perfect timing. They did not search for targets. They already knew. Soviet aviation regiments had been ordered not to disperse. Aircraft had been parked neatly on runways, lined up by type, wingtip to wingtip, fuselages gleaming in the dawn. They were beautiful. They were defenseless. The first bombs fell on Minsk airfield with mechanical precision. Rows of Soviet fighters erupted into fire. Fuel tanks burst. Engines melted into molten metal. Pilots scrambled from barracks only to stare in horror as their planes, everything they had trained with, vanished in fireballs rising into the morning sky. Within 40 minutes, the Western Front had lost nearly 500 aircraft. By noon, nearly 1,200 were gone. Pavlov's Air Force, the shield of his armies, had ceased to exist. As dawn broke, German infantry surged across the border. They moved with the precision of a machine long prepared for this task. Bridges were seized in minutes. Radio stations captured. Border outposts overrun before they could transmit more than a single warning. Soviet soldiers fought with courage. Many fought to the last round. But the shock was catastrophic. Many regiments had commanders asleep, vehicles uncrewed, ammunition locked in depots. German Panzer Group II moved like an iron spear. Tanks roared across the Bug River on prefabricated bridges. Armored columns split into multiple thrusts, bypassing Soviet strongpoints, ignoring pockets of resistance, plunging deep into Pavlov's rear areas. Their goal was not the frontier. It was Minsk. And the destruction of Pavlov's armies within the Bialystok Salient. Back in Minsk, Pavlov tried to form a response, but the situation dissolved faster than any plan could form. Communications collapsed. Phone lines went dead. Messages returned unanswered. Entire divisions vanished from the map, not destroyed, simply swallowed by the storm. At 6:15 a.m., Pavlov shouted over the cacophony. "Where is the 10th Army? What is their situation?" A radio operator shook his head. "Comrade General, we've lost contact." 5 minutes later. "The 3rd Army is retreating without orders." Then. "The 4th Army reports encirclement in multiple sectors." Then. No word from the 11th Mechanized Corps. Pavlov clenched his fists. These were not just units. They were the backbone of the Western Front. Entire armies, hundreds of thousands of men, disappearing into chaos. By mid-morning, German tanks had smashed through the Soviet 6th and 42nd Rifle Divisions. The breach widened with terrifying speed, 8 kilometers, then 20, then 45. Soviet Mechanized Corps attempted counterattacks, but their tanks were scattered, underfueled, and poorly coordinated. German commanders later wrote that the Soviet tank assaults came in waves of bravery, but not of structure. Burning hulks lined the roads. Abandoned vehicles choked crossroads. Soviet columns retreated under constant aerial attack, Stukas screaming downward with surgical precision. Every hour, the German advance deepened. Every hour, the circle around the Bialystok salient tightened. At 13:30, Pavlov returned to the map room. The same room he had stood in only hours earlier, insisting the Germans would not attack. Now the black pins, German positions, no longer matched the paper. They were far beyond anything the maps showed. They were behind his lines, cutting through supply roads, severing escape routes. His armies, forward deployed in a protruding arc, were now surrounded. The Germans had executed the very maneuver Soviet planners had feared for years. In the forests and fields west of Minsk, chaos swallowed the Soviet troops. Battalions marched in circles, radios dead, commanders missing. Columns became lost on unfamiliar roads. Vehicles abandoned when they ran out of fuel. Soldiers, exhausted and confused, stumbled through smoke-choked woods under constant attack. One Soviet officer later wrote, "There was no front. Only fire. Only the thunder of tanks from every direction." German armor sliced through the retreating columns. Machine guns swept the roads. Artillery blocked escape routes with walls of explosions. By June 24, the jaws closed completely. Over 300,000 Soviet soldiers were trapped. Helpless. Surrounded. Cut off. Attempts to break out failed. Some units fought to the last man. Others dissolved in the chaos. Tens of thousands were captured. Thousands more died in the forests, desperate to escape the tightening noose. On June 28, German forward units reached Minsk. The city, overwhelmed by refugees, smoke, and confusion, fell quickly. German commanders were astonished at the scale of the Soviet collapse. Within 6 days, Pavlov's Western Front, the largest and most critical frontier force in the Soviet Union, had ceased to exist. A tragedy unmatched in Red Army history. A blow so devastating that even Berlin struggled to comprehend its magnitude. The maps Pavlov had trusted were gone. The armies they directed were gone. The front he commanded had been swallowed whole by the speed and violence of the German assault. And in that moment, surrounded by ruin, reports of annihilation piling on his desk, Pavlov finally understood the full weight of his misreading. Not a small error. Not a minor misjudgment. A mistake that had opened the heart of the Soviet Union to invasion. A mistake that would cost millions of lives. A mistake that would change the entire war. In the final days of June 1941, as the fires of Belarus still burned and the German spearheads drove deeper into Soviet territory, the catastrophe of the Western Front reached Moscow. For entire Soviet armies, the 3rd, the 4th, the 10th, and much of the 13th, had been shattered or encircled within a week. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers were missing, dead, or captured. Aircraft losses reached numbers no other air force in history had suffered so quickly. Tanks, artillery, supply depots, entire arsenals, had been abandoned on the roads to Minsk. To Stalin, this was not merely a military defeat. It was a humiliation. A wound that needed a culprit. He demanded answers. He demanded names. And at the top of the list stood General Dmitry Grigorievich Pavlov. On July 4, less than 2 weeks after the invasion began, Pavlov was recalled to Moscow. He did not resist. He did not argue. He understood the ritual that awaited him. He was stripped of command. Stripped of rank. Stripped of every honor he had earned. The charges were swift and brutal. Cowardice. Incompetence. Failure to take measures for defense. There was no defense to mount. The verdict was already written. On July 22, 1941, Pavlov and several members of his staff were executed. A single volley. A quiet courtyard. No ceremony. No last words recorded. To the Soviet government, Pavlov became the symbol of failure. A convenient explanation for the unimaginable losses of the first week of war. But history is rarely so simple. The destruction of the Western Front was not the fault of one man. It was the culmination of years of fear, political purges, flawed assumptions, and systematic blindness. Pavlov had misread the maps. But the maps themselves had been drawn in a world where truth was dangerous and caution was fatal. A front deployed in a deadly salient. Armies forbidden to retreat. Airfields forbidden to disperse. Commanders afraid to report danger. Intelligence filtered until it fit the expectations of the Kremlin. His error was real. But it was shaped by forces larger than any general, The tragedy of Pavlov is not merely that he failed, but that he failed within a system designed to silence those who tried to warn of the storm. In the weeks that followed his death, the German advance continued almost unchecked. Smolensk fell. Kiev was encircled. Leningrad was isolated. The Soviet Union bent under the weight of invasion, losing ground measured not in kilometers, but in nations, cities, and millions of lives. Yet despite the catastrophe, the Soviet state endured. It rebuilt. It adapted. It learned from those first, devastating weeks. And the memory of Pavlov, once a symbol of disgrace, began to shift. After Stalin's death and the slow thaw of the Soviet political climate, historians re-examined the events of June 1941. They found new evidence. New documents. New testimonies. They found that Pavlov had requested permission to shift forces, permission denied. They found warnings he forwarded, warnings dismissed. They found intelligence he questioned, but was ordered to accept. They found plans he drafted, but was forbidden to implement. In 1957, 16 years after his execution, General Dmitry Pavlov was officially rehabilitated. His name was cleared. His honor restored. His legacy rewritten not as a traitor, but as a commander trapped between an unstoppable enemy and an unforgiving political system. Today, the story of Pavlov and the Western Front stands as one of the most tragic lessons in military history. It is the story of what happens when fear replaces truth. When leadership suppresses warning. When intelligence becomes a mirror of political desire instead of objective reality. It is the story of a front destroyed before it could fight, a general crushed under the weight of a mistake he could not fully understand. A map misread not only by Pavlov, but by an entire government. And above all, it is a reminder of the terrible price of unpreparedness. The fires of June 1941 reshaped the Second World War. They pushed the Soviet Union to the very edge of collapse. They unleashed battles of unimaginable scale, from Moscow to Stalingrad, from Kursk to Berlin. And they left behind a single, haunting truth. Sometimes the smallest error. The wrong line on a map. The wrong interpretation of a movement. The wrong assumption about an enemy. Can open the path to catastrophe. The dawn of June 22 still lingers in memory. The darkness. The silence. The sudden eruption of fire across the horizon. A general standing before a map he believed to be true. A nation caught unprepared. An invasion that would claim tens of millions of lives. In that moment, the fate of the Soviet Union, and the course of the Second World War, shifted forever. A single misread. A single night. A single war transformed